And let's go into topic number 1, which is talking about brew house efficiency. What you're really looking at when you're looking at brew house efficiency versus something like mash efficiency. And then we're going to give you some tips and tricks and some wherewithal on how to make sure that you're doing something consistent every single time you brew with efficiency, and also maximize your efficiency.
Yep. So brew house efficiency is I think people want to think that they know more about it than they do. Most homebrewers actually really don't understand what these numbers mean, and the number generally is expressed as a percentage, and what that actually says is it is total sugars that you get into your fermenter is the proper way to measure it, versus the total potential sugars of the grains that you're using in an all-grain batch of beer.
And this also takes into account volume, which is often overlooked, because a lot of people will be like, oh, I way overshot my gravity. I have, exactly 5 gallons of higher gravity wort, and they don't realize that their thing was set to like 5.5 gallons or something like that.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and so it's measuring volume is huge. I can't tell you how many people come and be like, oh yeah, totally hit 103% brew house efficiency on that batch of beer, and you're like,
that's impossible.
Not possible. And but you do you. So we're kind of going to just sort of dispel all these sort of myths about it, and really kind of break it down and let you know how all this works, and then really where these losses come from. Because your typical brew house efficiency for a home brewer is going to fall usually right in that mid 70s range. So 75% of the potential sugars that you have to convert actually get into your fermenter as fermentable wort.
Now, when people are starting to kind of troubleshoot or calculate out their brew house efficiency, the first thing they usually look at is how many starches got converted into sugars in their mash. And that's the number one place that you think about to look, because that's the number one thing that you learn about what you're doing with your mash to get those sugars out. And so there's a couple different ways that you can not get all the sugars out of your mash just from your mashing techniques. This could have to do with temperature, it could have to do with enzymes, it can have to do with lautering technique.
Yeah, so let's start with the conversion in your mash. So this happens when you go through your saccharification rest, so your give or take 150 degree mark when you're mashing in those grains, and you have enzymes that are going to go to town, that they're going to convert those starches into sugar, but very rarely do you get a 100% conversion, and generally that's just because not all those starches are going to kind of come out of the grains. Not all of them are going to get hit by the enzymes. But using higher amounts of adjuncts can inhibit this. It can slow down that process, so that 60-minute mash time might actually not be quite enough for you. But for the most part, if you do have a pale malt or a highly modified malt of any sort in there, you're going to get a pretty high conversion rate, typically 97, 98%. So if you are experiencing losses or you're experiencing a lack of conversion, you might want to actually look at your base malt and make sure that you have enough what's called diastatic power, which is the amount of those enzymes in there to properly convert your mash.
Think of it like this. There's a random chance that an enzyme is going to come in contact with the starch. At the very beginning of your mash, that chance is very, very high, and then the curve kind of regresses in a way that, there's fewer starches and the same amount of enzymes, or fewer enzymes because of degradation over time. So towards the end of all the conversion, it's kind of just not quite hitting 100%, but it's getting closer, just nearing 100% conversion. And so a base malt like 100% two-row pale that Logan was talking about, that not only has a lot of enzymes, it also has a lot of sugars that are already kind of ready to go. And so the contact is a little bit faster. But when you have a lot of adjuncts, not only are there less enzymes and less not less sugars, but less starches that are ready to get eaten by by enzymes. There's also what are called beta glucans, which kind of can affect how much flowability or how much contact the liquid has with all the starches.
Now we're getting into the step where we've gone through that conversion, and those beta glucans actually tend to kind of glob onto things. They're going to gum up your mash, which means that once you start to actually try to drain that sugar water off, these can have a pretty significant impact on how that drains. You can end up with issues like channeling. You can also end up with just overall lack of sort of rinsing from sparging, which end up leaving a lot of sugars in the mash itself. And this is actually a big part of inefficiency in the brewing process. Most people don't realize that when they're sparging out their mash tun and they're getting down and they're getting full, take a gravity sample of your last runnings. Odds are you're going to have, 10 a gravity reading of 1010 or 1015, and what that means is there's still sugars in your mash tun, and there's really not a good way to avoid that. And you're going to have losses regardless there. This is usually going to make up, I would say 5 to 10% of your losses, depending on your mash tun.
Just get 30 gallons in your boil and then boil it for 5 days.
Yeah, so if you do have things that are like a hazy, for instance, that does have a lot of those like oats and flaked wheat that have those like high amounts of beta glucans in there, the best way to attack that is going to be to slow down your sparge. And then also, we'll talk about it just a little bit later, but also adding enzymes to help with that.
So you can also try things like a protein rest or just a longer mash time in general. So we do, we'll do like ramped. We'll mash in at like 130, and then we'll do a ramped kind of mash overnight that gets us up to 160 in like 8 hours, and that makes us really consistent.
Fun facts with Timothy.
Did you know if you cross a polar bear with a grizzly bear, it's a pizzly bear? Now you do.
Fun facts with Timothy.
So all that to say, one way to lose efficiency is you're not able to rinse all the sugars off your grain because beta-glucans create layers.
Yep.
So let's go into other losses because there's also a lot of losses in, let's do dead space first, and then we'll go on to what happens in the boil.
Yeah, so dead space is a term that's going to be thrown out there, and what dead space means is it means that is the space in any one of your brewing vessels that you're just not going to get liquid out of. So
yeah, that's your pumps. That's a lot of your tubing.
Yep.
Under your false bottom, if you have a false bottom of your mash tun, there's always some liquid in there, and all that's just it doesn't add up to a ton, but it is something you need to calculate for in losses in bigger systems, like on the.
It definitely can though.
Yeah, well, I was going to say on the 7-barrel system we use downtown, there's probably 15 to 30 gallons just in loss from dead space in the system.
Yep. So and even your brew house at home. I mean, I think I figured almost a third of a gallon by the time you're running things like you said through your hoses, through like if you got a counterflow chiller.
Yeah, that can add up quite a bit.
And then dead space in your mash tun as well. Yeah. That dead space in your mash tun can actually add up to like almost a half gallon sometimes.
So let's go on to the boil. Obviously, there's dead space, and in your fermenter too, you can also count for losses in that, but we'll talk about that later. So going on to the boil, the number one thing that a lot of people don't realize how big of an impact it has on things like IPAs is hop absorption, because that can account for a lot of liquid loss.
Yeah, so fun facts, when you add hops to beer, they actually absorb some of that wort, and you're not really getting that back out of them because it's falling down the bottom. It's going to have that big trube cake down there on the bottom of hop materials, and they're actually absorbing your wort. So that can make up, especially for these New World IPAs, a very, very significant amount of losses. I mean, if you're throwing 12 ounces of hops at a beer, that could be a half gallon of your wort that's absorbing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's pretty reasonable to calculate about a gallon per pound of hops that you're losing, somewhere in that range.
So that's one thing to consider as well. That's something that you definitely want to take into consideration when you're building up these hazies. That's also why a lot of times you'll see little bigger grain bills. Don't be surprised if your efficiency takes a big hit when you start throwing 8 or 12 ounces of hops at a 5-gallon batch of beer. I mean, I would be impressed if you hit much more than 70, to be honest. Especially if you're using traditional hops. Also consider hop absorption when you're dry hopping these beers too. You're also going to lose beer in your fermenter. So I always tell people, shoot a little bit higher for your pre-boil gravities on those beers.
And just calculate out to a higher volume whenever you're doing heavily hopped beers.
Yeah. So hop absorption is the other way that you can lose efficiency. So ultimately, these guys add up to typically that 25%, give or take, of your losses, which, 10% here, 5% there.
It adds up pretty quick. And so getting over 80% efficiency with a true calculation actually is pretty difficult. And it can happen if you're doing everything the really, really good, correctly way.
Yeah, so speaking of which, let's talk about the right way to do it. So in order to really get an accurate reading of your brew house efficiency, you really need to have accurate volume measurements in your fermenter itself, and then an accurate way to take the gravity of the beer that hits that. Like Peter mentioned earlier, I think where most people go wrong is in the fermenter volume. People tend to take accurate readings of their gravity pretty easily, but they're not accurately taking a reading of their fermenter volume. And the difference between 5 gallons and 5.5 gallons can actually have a significant impact on your brew house efficiency.
Almost like approximately 10%. Yeah, so let's talk about ways to maximize that efficiency. The first and probably the easiest for a lot of people to do, and I see it done early on, is a bigger sparge and a longer boil.
Yeah, so it's a basic equation. If you're rinsing out more sugars from your mash, you don't have those losses. They're getting into your boil. Doing a longer boil means that you're going to boil off a higher rate and condense those sugars back down. So that's a pretty straightforward one. You're going to have higher efficiencies regardless. That's why, especially for higher alcohol beers, like barley wines, like imperial stouts, a lot of Belgian beers, you're going to have those extended boils. And that's just because you're wasting a lot of sugar when you're cutting off your gravity at like 10:30.
Yeah. There's a lot of sugar left in there.
There's a lot of sugar left in there. It's also why people do Party Guile beers.
Party Guile. So if you are planning on doing a high alcohol beer, then go ahead and plan on rinsing off a little bit extra and doing a longer boil. The longer boil is going to help the flavor of the beer, and then also you're just going to get a little bit more efficiency off it. The other option would be Bartleby Guile.
Bartleby Guile. So the next thing is going to be a slower sparge. A lot of times, like we talked about earlier, if you've got a higher adjunct load, or it just kind of depends on your system too.
If it's more vertical.
Yeah, exactly. If you got a deeper grain bed that you're trying to sparge through, slowing down that sparge, not just basically throwing a bunch of water, letting it rinse through real fast, can actually help out your efficiency in a couple of ways. And that's, for one, you're not going to get that channeling. You're not going to lose as much from just the overall.
It's got longer times to absorb the shiggies.
Yep.
And then it's also not compacting the grain bed. And so we talked about those beta-glucans earlier. Those beta-glucans, they are hydrophobic. They push away water. And so if those beta-glucans compact into more of a flat layer, then it's sending your sparge water over into a different direction. That's what we mean by channeling. And so by slowing your sparge, you're keeping your grain bed nice and fluffy, and you're eliminating that potential compaction, which can ruin your efficiency.
Yeah. So ultimately doing that's going to give you more sugars from the mash into your kettle.
The other way to do it is to minimize dead space losses with quality equipment. So that means it could be the difference of a false bottom without a dip tube and a false bottom with a dip tube. We've talked about how you might not be getting full conversion in your mash due to low diastatic power. And we've also talked about beta-glucans. These both can be solved with an ingredient called enzymes. And specifically, the ones that we use are Amylax 4T, which is a mash enzyme. It can also be known as OptiMash from a different vendor. That's going to give you more enzymes to get you to maximize your conversion. And then to eliminate those beta-glucans, which can lower your efficiency, we have something called ViscoBuster.
So that's actually going to break down those beta-glucans in there. So depending on what you're going for, this might not be the best idea just because those also contribute significantly to the body of the beer. So adding enzymes, we have them available these days. In fact, I'm going to make Peter link them down in the description of this video.
Sure.
If you do want to check those guys out, because they have been a game changer for us, especially for just speeding up the whole process and for kind of having little tricks up our sleeves for, like I just mentioned, a Märzen. I know we've done some West Coast style IPAs where we hit, a little bit of alpha amylase right at the end of the mash there, just to dry that out. So we end up, with a 1060 beer that goes down to like 07 or 08 and just gets bone dry for us without having to add corn sugar, which is always awesome. And so there's a million different uses for these guys, and they're fairly inexpensive and they go a long way. So
and one more thing about having something like the mash enzymes, the Amylax 4T, which is also the OptiMash, something like that. If you were to, let's say you accidentally mash in at like 156 degrees.
Yeah, that's a great
point.
point.
You've just killed a lot of your beta amylase. You've killed a good chunk of your alpha amylase. So you wait for that to get back down to like 152. Then you go ahead and add in your enzymes that you already have stored, and you've just saved your brew. So it's a good thing to just have on hand. Make sure that you have a consistent overall process, and don't be focusing on maximizing efficiency before focusing on making sure you're efficiency is consistent.